My name is Sheila Lamb, and I'm with the Virginia SBDC Network. For those of you that are not familiar with our organization, the Virginia Small Business Development Center is a partnership program between the U.S. Small Business Administration, George Mason University, and local host institutions throughout Virginia. With 26 locations across the Commonwealth, we provide training and technical assistance to small businesses in their local communities. Our one-on-one advising services are available at no charge. Today's webinar, Craft Beverage Storytelling, Visual Strategies to Build Your Brand and Community, is presented by the Virginia SBDC Network. We are recording today's presentation and it will be posted on our website, virginiasbdc.org. Due to the large number of participants, everyone's microphone is muted and the chat feature is turned off. But if you have questions during the presentation, you can type those into the Q&A box. We have also enabled the live transcript function, which you can show or hide via your own meeting controls. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the Virginia SBDC Craft Beverage Assistance Program Manager, Chris Van Orden.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this conversation about storytelling in the competitive craft beverage industry. As Sheila said, my name is Chris Van Orden. I'm the manager of the Craft Beverage Assistance Program at the Virginia SBDC. The CBA program is designed to provide industry-specific assistance to Virginia's craft beverage sector. So today's program is going to be a free-flowing discussion on the ways in which breweries, wineries, cideries, distilleries can build and grow their audiences through compelling visuals. You can enter any questions that you might have in the Q&A function. Again, Q&A function, if you don't mind, the comments are harder for us to track, and we'll do our best to answer all of them either during or after the webinar. So I am excited to welcome Daniel James, founder of Herd Ventures, which endeavors to connect people to one another through food. As a brand strategist and content creator, DJ specializes in building narratives that resonate with customers by using dynamic photography and creative videography. So today we're going to be discussing how producers can convey their messages and build community through those thoughtful visuals. Welcome, DJ.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. So before we kind of dig into the nuts and bolts of what your work is, maybe we can start off kind of going through some terms of art, just the way that you speak about things. So in your work and based on some things I've heard you discuss in other settings, you tend to distinguish between narrative marketing and brand storytelling. Can you share with our audience kind of the differences between these two approaches?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of it too is just that framing of, you get to the actual storytelling, but beforehand too, it's like, what are those narrative arcs? How do those things complement each other? So usually the two, and there's great writers on this, there's books all over the place too, Seth Godin, like Ronald Miller, some of these other folks too, and they all have different terms, which makes it kind of difficult sometimes. But the two I kind of focus in on too are narrative marketing and brand storytelling. And to just make sure, one of them kind of falls within the other, and I can explain that more. But narrative marketing, if you distill everything down, it's really who is the hero when you're asking that question. So in narrative marketing, it's much more a focus on like the brand experience. So you're much more of a customer-centric focus in your storytelling, that they are the hero. They're the ones doing all of these things. I'll use a couple of examples throughout. I'll try to relate it back to alcohol too, but like Red Bull's a great example of it's a very easy one to recognize, right? It is that experience of those niche sports that people are doing too. You hardly ever see the product really at all. It's much more about like those folks, those consumers. And on the other hand, you kind of have the brand story. Brand story kind of falls within, because it's a form of narrative marketing, but that's more focused on the hero being, the company themselves too, right? Like, what do you do? Why do you do it? How are you different? Why do you matter? So it's much more of that personal story that you'll see with folks. So those are usually the two big camps, and it's really just helpful because it's a framework for how you move forward in terms of your pre-production, in terms of deciding what that story really is that you want to be telling. And one of them has a much higher success rate than the other. So we'll get into that a little bit more too.
All right. I love you just set it up perfectly then. So when you're working with a company, if somebody is coming to you, right, blank slate saying, hey, we need to do a better job of reaching out there, communicating our message, which camp do you tend to push them towards, and how do you kind of get their heads around the way of thinking that way?
Usually for me, I mean, I do very much. I mean, I have like game cards too and other things that I'll take clients through, but just in terms of really diving down and finding out those things too. So there's usually not one camp is better than the other in terms of this is the only one for you. I think it becomes a little more difficult, and there's usually like a balance between those two. And I'll use some examples later too about how I tried to, again, like very concisely explain to a lot of times I work with farmers and value add producers, but it's a lot of folks that do have these craft stories that tie in somehow to the land or to the place that they're at. But usually it's a mix of those things too. But a lot of the times what we miss out on is focusing on the consumer in that narrative. And it's much more of a focus on like those product shots or whatever it is. So normally what I do is I'll take people through a process that helps them start to wean that out. I don't know if you've ever come across somebody that just goes, I mean, it's a pretty basic story that we have. It's not. There's a lot of nuance to that, and sometimes it's hard to have that perspective of the outside view. But a lot of the times it's an amalgam of both of those. So I wouldn't say that there's one that I just tell people like you need to do that. It really depends on the company and the purpose of that company. But a lot of the times it's like if you work through a narrative arc and work through your story and find out, hey, a lot of these things that are inherent in my personal story, or like if there's one CEO, a lot of the times you can find that there's really just an identity that that person has that they share with a lot of their consumers as well. And then there's other times where like that brand story really helps out. Like I don't know, you Papa John'd it from your garage all the way to like a national franchise. And you really think that like that story people can align with. So yeah, it's a little bit of both.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it's helpful to just frame this even for people when they're starting to think about it. So you don't have people working at cross purposes where everybody's, one side's focused on product shots and all we care about is the process. And then you've never seen a person actually drink the beverage or people's interactions with it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of what I get asked earlier on too, just be like, it's just product shots. It's just that product in different spaces. And that usually misses out. That's fine for like, again, brand story, but that's really not a story. Sometimes it's like, ooh, we found a different backdrop. Do you like this one? Like mahogany versus, stone or whatever it is though, too. But a lot of the times people, don't really want to be sold to in that way where like they get it, they get that that's the product. The part that a lot of companies are missing out on is what's the story that goes with that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And that's particularly hard in the drinks industry. I mean, you pour a glass of wine or a glass of beer, they all generally look the same, right? Where, you make a meal, some meals look better than others. I've definitely seen unappealing, pints of beer or drams of whiskey, but by and large are the same. So there has to be a little bit more there. So.
Yeah, and I'll get shot. I mean, I've done a bunch of these too, like wines pouring at 120 frames a second in 4K. Like it could be 300K. It really doesn't matter unless there's a narrative that's tying in with that too. And that's how you lose a lot of the times. People lose an audience too, because I think they just need to see it. And I think marketing's had a very long history. I got into marketing because I hated it. I thought it was the sabotage of salience. Like I thought it was this thing that like, oh, we want to stay on top of your mind, but then not provide you a value to that. Right. And then that now has started going back a little bit too. And none of the things that I'm really talking about are that, I wouldn't say new. People talk about a resurgence in storytelling. And I think it's just, people haven't really taken that time. They've come up with a great product. They've got the distribution set. Those are all really tough things to get through. And while you're so focused and zeroed in on that, you forget that there's this beautiful flowing story that's been going along the whole time. But it usually feels like from the business owner's perspective, peaks and valleys and, the entrepreneurial journey that you don't want to sit there and be like, do I want to tell people about how I was broke at one point and then we somehow made it through? No, you don't need to do that. But yeah, what is that narrative and being able to keep an eye on it and check in on that every once in a while too, not just to leave it on its own and assume, hey, we came up with like, this is how we're going to brand it. And it becomes stagnant, but that stagnancy, it brings mosquitoes and malaria, but it also just makes it where you lose your audience and then people aren't there anymore.
Yeah. Having that fresh, but certainly genuine, right? Determining what the story is for you. And I think that you mentioned values, and I think that's a really like important thing for companies because this is an industry you don't get into because it's the best way to make money, right? The fastest way to become a millionaire in the drinks industry is to start with $2 million. So, well, okay, well, what is the sort of ethos, the motivation behind all of this? And so if you're working with a company that may be, all right, obviously you have to professionalize this business. You get really caught up in the business end of your company of just, okay, we made these sales, this is our numbers. How do you help them to get a better sense or reconnect with their values or their story, kind of help define that for them, where they might have just only known it innately without being consciously communicating it yet?
I mean, on the personal side of that question, usually I invite them over for dinner and I cook for them too, because the quickest way to anyone's heart is through their stomach. But that's just my personal approach. I think in general too, really, it's just getting back to the bigger questions in general. And I think it's really hard nowadays too, in terms of, how do I put this best? One of the biggest things that's missed out on in communicating or reaching consumers, what they're looking for really is that authenticity. And that's something that's very difficult to get across sometimes. Authenticity is something that affluence cannot simply purchase, but it is something that you can invest in, that being authentic in a sense. So when you want to get your values across, and there's certain problems that I see with that too, some of the times, in the idea of, I think the term is virtue signaling, that where it's and to me, virtue signaling is really just the inconsistency of supporting certain mission values only, at a certain time. So if that becomes a common thread, and that's one of the things that I promote with storytelling in general too, like be clear, be concise, and be consistent, and if you do decide early on and you're, working through kind of like, what are we really trying to do? And if companies come to me and they say like, well, we're trying to, say sell drinks to people. Cool. Which people? Anyone over 21. That's a big problem. It's, I think it starts becoming really refining that out and finding who that is too. And then being consistent with what your values are, what you are trying to promote, what is that identity? And for some people, I mean, I've seen this with farmers too, and, drinks and with everything, like, we just want to make something good. And I'm like, I totally get that. I get that it's as simple as that, but there is some nuance. Think about the aromatics, think about like the flavors, the layering of that in your drink. Use your drink or whatever that is too, as an example for, what you're trying to make. So sometimes I'll just work with folks, have them go through and just tell me their story, what they think their story is. And sometimes you don't do it through the thing itself. You can do it through, like, anthropomorphize the drink itself, right? Give me the personality, give me the, I mean, wines have been doing this for a while, right?
Yeah.
And in a weird way too, because it's kind of like, I don't know. I've always been weirded out. My aunt was a wine broker, so I was always around that stuff growing up. So when people were like, oh, I get a lot of oak and and I'm just sitting there going like, what was your childhood like? Like, what were you forced to do at that age? But you can give it a personality. And then through that, good example is when I do stuff with farms, a lot of times I will ask people what their produce patronus is. For those of you that don't know Harry Potter, it's like a spell that is good energy that's going out, but, or, you could say spirit vegetable, whichever way though, but it's this idea of what vegetable do these people align themselves with and why? So, you could do that with a company too. And I could ask everybody like, all right, which of the wines in your guys' portfolio, like which one is this person? Which one is this person? And you can start to come up with profiles for that too. So there's a number of different venues to diving into it. But I think the biggest thing is just, you start to pull out with folks too, asking them things bigger than just like what's happening in the company right now. It's really figuring out their own personal identity. And then if they align with that and with the product too, it doesn't feel forced. And that's the biggest thing about marketing to me, is not feeling like you're making something up, but you're just putting it out there. People aren't really seeing you, they're seeing themselves, or they're not really seeing your product, they're seeing themselves.
Yeah. I like that you have a lot of ways to coax it out, because some strategies for this, I mean, self-analysis is hard to do, and that goes for founders as much as anybody else. And, there's some ways of thinking about it that people are just not going to get behind. So if just say, all right, let's try another tack. And, if you're a business person, first and foremost, you might call it your unique value proposition, right? I mean, it's a very crowded industry. If we're all making cider, like, okay, well, what's your perspective? Are you in love with the heritage? Are you an innovation person? Are you a quality above all else? Like, spare no expense quality. Are you here to, because like you love this little corner of the world, whatever it is, there's a reason that you got into it and the reason you set your company up the way that you did.
Yep.
But all of those innate decisions, you may have never vocalized them even once, right? And so how do you convey that to folks? It seems like it's really tough for some folks.
It is, and keeping consistent on one or two of them, and again, pulling out, like, I mean, I made this joke once before, but I can't put brand therapist on my business card, but it sometimes feels that way. Like you're trying to work through and coax out what is it that the why behind that too. What are these repetitive patterns that you get into with the storytelling that it feels sometimes it's very spurious. So like you said too, like, the heritage story, the history story, the quality of product. I personally love sourcing stories, right? And the journey that a food item takes or a drink item takes all the way from where it starts to when it gets to that person at the end too. But that idea of expedition and journey, big on those. But same thing, but if you're hopping and jumping around to try to cover all of them, you really never give any time to any one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you're a company that tries to be everything is actually nothing. So I like that point about the sort of scattershot, like let's try everything and see what sticks. I think that's a lot of companies do that. They see what other people are doing. Oh, this was successful for this company. This was successful for that company. We'll try them all on. And you kind of dilute like who you are when you're at that point. So when you're working with somebody, kind of going from the theory to practice, let's say you've helped people think through who are we? And maybe to date, they've only had that scattershot approach to visual storytelling. Where do you suggest they start? What are the sort of like, okay, right away, these are the things that I want you to have, like to start thinking about, start putting into place, just base level, entry level stuff.
We usually, we start at the beginning and then we go to the middle and then we go to the end. And as cheeky as that may sound, I mean, it really does go back to that. Start at the beginning. What is the problem? What is the problem that you're solving, and get to that point, explain the problem that you set out to solve in the first place, the reason that you got inspired. When you get to the middle is very much the solution. So like, how did you solve it and describe that out? And then at the end is success. Like, what was that, aspect of, what got you excited about that success, about this product or where it came out and how it got to the shelf in the first place. Another way of looking at that too, that I usually talk about, and I developed this out more for farmers because I was doing a lot of these sourcing stories, and farmers are a great example of a group that have zero marketing budget usually. So you got to get creative. I actually tried starting a farm 15 years ago, traveled the country to do my own, business research. And that's how I got into all of it. I realized that stories were missing and good food doesn't sell itself anymore. It needed a clear and concise story. And then it started realizing that this is really anything craft in general too. So it is very story driven around that. So for those folks, I started developing out the idea of thinking about, if my company is at a farmer's market, what are the 4 photos that I need to have there to be able to tell a story? Because the reality is that I'm not trying to provide people with answers. I'm trying to give them one better question that I want them to ask me. That creates so much more of a value when you can help build that curiosity for a product as opposed to just explaining and putting it out. So for the farms, and this kind of, I'll give them different names so that it makes sense too, though, but a lot of it was, seeing them on the farm, seeing the, food item itself, then connecting those two things, and then seeing it on the plate. And then breaking those down, a lot of it was identify yourself. So this is going to be more of that brand story. Like, you should identify yourself, or I think so, because I think a lot of consumers in general, we're really looking for, part of that authenticity is transparency. Who are the people that are doing this, instead of nameless, faceless brands, especially around craft drinks? Part of that is that story. And so identify yourself. And then the second part is identifying the source and tying in your story to the journey story and where it's going along. The third one being like where is it in that environment? A lot of the times I would say this, like get the farmer and the cow on the field, like pair those things together, because, a lot of the times it's, people will show up and they're saying like, oh, who made this product? Who's actually, oh, you are the person that is doing this.
Yeah.
And to be very fair, brewers, viticulturists, all these different areas too around, craft drinks, people don't know how to identify like what a farmer looks like.
Yeah.
Like what a brewer looks like. I mean, that one's gotten, there are tropes about that one.
Yeah.
But especially in the beer department. But like the same thing though, like identifying yourself, tying those two things together. And then when I say seeing, the item on the plate or that fourth shot, really it's consumer perspective. It is that narrative marketing. So in that packet, you've kind of got 2 and 2 in terms of, brand story and narrative marketing. But the key to the whole thing is really just figuring out, when somebody's going to take a glance, and I think it actually helps even places that have brick and mortars and, tasting rooms, all this fun stuff. Think about that. If you could only have 4 photos to tell your story, what are those 4 and what journey does that come along? How are you crossing in not only your narrative in that too, but also the consumer's perspective? And then that distilled down version, I'm going to try to stop saying distilled. I kept thinking about it this morning. But in terms of what are those 4 photos, and then those really are your narrative lines that you can shoot out from. You could just envision them on a wall and then just imagine replacing them every month or whatever.
Yeah.
In terms of, and that's how you start building out some of these narratives. This is how you start. I mean, a lot of the times I try to convince companies of the fact that, we can do a shoot to create content, fill a silo, all that fun stuff. But in reality, you should be thinking about it in terms of what are we going to do for the next 6 months, or maybe for this year, let's go ahead and try something out, and thinking about narrative arcs within that too. There are a lot of trends that are coming out too, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or however else in terms of digital assets. But the one trend that is continuous is that it's incredibly important to have digital assets and be telling stories where you're reaching folks wherever they're at. But yeah, to take it all the way back, just beginning, middle, end. Like think about the problem, think about the solution, and definitely think about what that success is. And don't be too hard on yourself.
Yeah, it's a compelling story. I mean, especially in this industry, people are choosing you intentionally. They could find a cheaper product elsewhere. They want to buy from people, giving them that. And I like the using the term arc and thinking of it, in truly cinematic terms, right? We're talking about storyboarding here of, how are you crafting a literal narrative of like, this is the process here. Here's our end of it. Here's where you get involved. There needs to be something that people can follow along in a process. It's not just these static independent things that are happening somewhere at some point, right? I think that the connection, there's in this industry in particular, you have people want to know about food. That's why these industries exist. It's not just a factory that occurs out somewhere distant and all of a sudden it shows up on their shelf.
Yeah, it's I used to always call it, it's funny, the number keeps changing. I used to call it the $3 gap. Now it's the $5 gap. But what's the difference between, let's say, like a $20 bottle of wine and a $25 bottle of wine? That $5 is really made up in the story. And that's what adds the value to it. Like I said, food and drink, it used to sell itself. Now it's really, if you can tell a clear and concise story and add that to it. And a lot of the times, and I'll use this example too with hamburgers, what's the difference between a $10 and a $15? Usually on the menu, it's like where it says underneath, like, we bought it from such and such farm, or, we put on there, but then there's a lot of confusion around that too, because I know too much. But yeah, just in terms of when people are trying to list something and it looks like a farm, but it's not, it's just a slaughterhouse, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it is in the storytelling. And I think that's a big part of where that additional value. And like when you're trying to compete with these much larger companies, you really have to invest more in terms of that story. And again, what differentiates you? And the differentiation, a lot of the times, this is where, again, for certain industries, that would probably come more into that brand story, right? Because like, I can see that person, I can relate to that person. And that larger company is just nameless, faceless, like they can't provide that value.
Yeah.
So they are doing a lot more of the narrative marketing because they're reaching this identity around something. And you can name any large like beer company, for example, and like start to see that as a trend too, like Dos Equis, and right, like most interesting man of the, right, that's like an identity thing. But yeah, I think it's kind of it's getting a little harder and harder, but it's also like if you focus on the right areas, it just makes it easy and you can stay consistent in that lane.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a question come in and I'm just going to address it here. So Stephanie is listening while she's roasting coffee. Hi, Stephanie. And asked if it will be recorded and sent out. Yes, this will be recorded, so you'll be able to tune in later and hopefully hear us better. But yes, roasting coffee. Yeah, that's important work. So good luck. Save us a cup. So let's say if you've worked with one of these companies, they've started to put some of these pieces in place. They've gotten into a little bit of the habit, or at least wrap their head around building out the content that fits into those, 4-part storyboards. They're starting to visualize that they have a better sense of what they want to communicate out. Now we're into the operational side, right? Like, okay, it's not good enough to just say, I know what I need to do, but then there's a lot of work that gets involved in all of this, right? This stuff doesn't just happen. I feel like there's memes now of people working in production facilities, and then they're like, oh no, the social media person's here, and there's people doing very hard work, and then like, a 22-year-old comes in and is just like flitting around them shooting, but it's important.
Yeah.
And so, right, it's a lot of work to continue to update that, make sure that you're capturing, where your business is at. So for producers that are a little bit further along, how do you work with them to make sure that, I think you use the term filling their silo, and we're not necessarily talking just blowing grain into a silo for breweries and distilleries, but the content silo, like how do you work with people to improve on that front?
Yeah. All right. So two things on that too. One is, please always tell your staff beforehand when you're going to force them to have somebody with a camera there. I ask people all the time too, because I deal with farmers a lot and folks that don't want to be on camera. So I have a very good rapport with people and can make jokes around like, would you mind just being a hand model today? No, they're gorgeous. I love your hands. Mm-hmm. Those kind of things. But I think the biggest thing about those is a lot of the time the energy gets wasted a little bit because there's not a narrative. There isn't an idea around like, it usually, again, I've had this hundreds of times, but it's kind of like, yeah, can we just get, pictures of it here and pictures of it here and pictures of it there? It's like, it's far more important if you do the pre-production and you figure out some of these narratives that you really want to tell too, where it's more of identity, ambiance, things like that, where like, if you get really good at it too, you don't even put your product in those shots a lot of the times. And that would make sense later. But when you're trying to do that and fill that content silo, having an idea ahead of time. So I do a lot of hybrid shooting, so photo and video, and I'll talk with folks beforehand and be very mission directive about, all right, we need this many photos, but for what? Like I've given companies before like 500 photos and 2 of them go up. And so it's really thinking about, in the same way that you're thinking about your company really itself, like we have to figure out the recipe. That's the pre-production. We need to actually produce this drink. Great. That's the production. And then we really need to think about the distribution. Where is this going out to? And like, I talk to a lot of folks about this too. Think ahead of time about, I'm not going to film a bunch of reels and turn my camera sideways if you're not on Instagram and TikTok, if you're not on a lot of these platforms too, where you're going to be reaching people. Mm-hmm. So thinking about that ahead of time. And then, knowing, all right, we really need to replace this, and this photo on the website. It's a little outdated. Mm-hmm. Great. So, you need that shot. We're going to use a bunch of these for social media. Fantastic. I would send out that 22-year-old more with an idea too. Like, I need 5 things that really show this personality trait, of the winery, brewery, or distillery. And then same thing in terms of actually lining up those shoots. Usually 1 of 2 things happens. One is, let's do it on a day where we're not that busy, and nothing's happening and the place is empty and it's a lot of fun. You don't need to hire models or fake people necessarily though, but get that 22-year or whoever else, like get them to have a couple of friends there or invite a couple of your friends over. Make it something where it is engaging and it is fun, because nothing is more painful than literally forcing people to like be a part of a story that they're not a part of. And the same thing, a lot of the times too, like, I meet a good number of brewers too, and maybe a few of them are like camera facing, and others really aren't enjoying that much. You can still get shots with like them talking, and it's just them walking through the facility, and all you see is their back. You know, that still identifies with a person, but you don't need to put them up in the forefront. But I would say though, you know, if you're having somebody come out and tell stories, do content, all that stuff, don't make their first visit the time that you're actually collecting that content. Have them come out, meet people, talk under a situation too, where it's lower, you know, stress and pressure, so that then when they do show up, hopefully it's actually on a busier day and they already have a little bit of a rapport. You can already get in there too. I call it peeling the onion because everything's a food reference, but you know, you want to be able to have already connected with folks and then be able to get in there. And again, knowing concepts that you're shooting more than just, I need 5 shots of, like, again, the wine pouring shots. So much fun. You know, you can only make splashes look so luxurious so many times.
You could just take one of the, just get borrow one from the big shot. There's probably lots of publicly available shots of wine being poured from a bottle in slow-mo.
Well, and we tried doing this too. It's really funny too. You know, it's part of one of the problems that I do see too, is like keeping up with trends. A lot of times people will, in these companies, think, you know, let's put something up that I want to watch, as opposed to their consumers, right? Or like that identity of like, and it's kind of tough because a lot of folks have started these companies from scratch. So that whole idea of like separating yourself from the identity of the brand itself. We did this with a winery, I think last year, but you know, they had golf tied in with the wine in certain ways, and putting. And so I was getting the staff to do putting, and then we were taking a bottle of the stuff and like celebrating, like, and we did take after take of them hitting it into the hole, you know, until we finally got one. And then they open a bottle of champagne and like throw it everywhere. We had so much fun with the staff. Like, they were asking for me to come back. Now the owner really didn't like that content. They were like, what is this supposed to be? You know, and they wanted more of when I played guitar behind the bottle of wine being poured. And I had literally set up the camera and I was like, do you guys have a musician? There was no musician that day. So I just grabbed a guitar out of the car and then sat there and started playing a song behind it. And then, you know, having somebody else pour the wine, you know, but it's that same thing. And then while we're shooting that, customers are actually walking in and they're very curious, like, what's happening. I do my best always to try to then incorporate people in. So like those shoots themselves can be a lot of fun. And that's a lot of what I try to go for too, is like engage. It's not just the audience itself, but like if you can engage your staff into some of this stuff where, again, it's not the painful, like, seriously, it's a Tuesday, you're doing this to me right now. Like, I didn't even, you know, do my hair. You know, as opposed to that, it does become this own activity where like that marketing and that media can become something that is also enjoyable to create. And when it's enjoyable to create, that comes across to, I feel like, to your consumers as well. So yeah, I just wouldn't surprise people. And just remember too, it's more about the pre-production, the actual production. I have tons of toys. Like I can shoot with like 8K cameras and sliders that are automated. None of that matters if there's not a story that's there. And if it's not engaging with the people that are around it while you're doing it, it just you're not providing a value to anyone. You're just kind of trying to stay salient. And that's kind of where I was tying it to, like, have you ever heard that phrase, like the sabotage of salience?
No, I haven't heard that.
I made it up years ago, but like, it was just one of those things where, you know, it just felt that way. Like the jingles and the songs that they would come up with, it was like, great, now you're stuck in my head. You're one of the top 3 things I think of and do nothing with.
Yeah.
You know? So it's part of that is staying, you do want to stay somewhat salient, but like to me, it's more about what value are you providing with that content. And again, making people feel like either that they are the heroes or that they appreciate something that you have done and want to support that. Because when people look at a product, half of it is really, and this is any piece of artwork, half of it is they're buying that actual thing. The other half is they're buying you and either what you've done or what they feel like they're doing when they're purchasing it.
Yeah. And I really value the importance of defining what we're doing here on the front end and giving people heads up. I have nobody really wants me doing too much marketing, although I have done some in the past, and and I think that I learned the hard way about not surprising people, about making sure
Oh.
they're comfortable, right? Just, like, oh yeah, we just need things. And like, yeah, things need to be captured, and especially big days, but being clear about, okay, well, what is this campaign about? What are we trying to convey here? What are we trying to capture? I mean, you don't have to have a full shot list. We're not talking, you're not shooting a full scripted movie, but
Yeah.
hey, these are the things that we're trying to capture today. Be ready. If you're not comfortable being on camera, like, let us know, right? That kind of due diligence on the front end, I think is very, very much appreciated by the folks who are, all they care about is, they're on the packaging line. I didn't come ready today. So
Yeah, yeah. And I get overexcited about the most random things. I'm like, are you guys gonna wrap that whole thing in plastic?
yeah.
Like the whole box of
Mhm.
crates and everything? Like, all right, I have an idea. Let's time lapse it, but from the side, and same thing. You can get people excited about those things and showing them some of those stories. But I would agree with you. I call it the navigational beacons. It's kind of like set up don't come up with like a precise shot list. A lot of the times it's setting up those navigational beacons so that somebody can stay between those and have an idea of what they're doing. My favorites, and when you show up somewhere and they're like, I don't know, just can you capture all of this? I'm like, I mean, okay, sure, we can do that, but it's not going to be the quality that you're thinking about, because that front end, where it's kind of like, when brands are developing and people, I used to run a lot of incubators, and when people would show up and just be like, here's the name of the company, I'm like, is that all? Like, that's the tip of the iceberg. You don't come up with that first. I mean, you can have a placeholder, but you got to figure out the body of it. It's the same thing with storytelling. And I feel like a lot of folks just jump to that point where they're like, I need a business card. It's like, for what? Like, you have to have a call to action. You have to have, a funnel that feeds into, so that is just a piece. And the same thing, the digital assets, taking that photo, making that video clip, that is a part of that process. But I feel like for a lot of companies, it just gets seen as that's all we have to do, and we've got it. It's a catchy name, and that'll explain it all. You got to really think about the beginning, the middle, and the end.
So getting to that end point, and this is a question that did come up. Thank you, Alejandra. But she asked, on which platforms has your storytelling worked the most? Like, how do you, when you're developing content, knowing about the ultimate application, how do you think about those things? Where do you tend to see more or less success? I'm sure that there's a whole discussion in and of itself about the strategy behind where you put your content. But can you just give us some top line perspective on that?
I think the biggest thing is just looking at that feedback. It's like anything else too. You got to stick with something for a little bit, see how it's actually working, not just based on the first few. I mean, I've helped with companies too, where like the first, I don't know, 15 posts, or that was like 10 or 15. We're not tracking at all. But then once people did discover one video that got out to a wider audience, they then go back and watch all the others. Right. So it can kind of catch on. But I think it's looking at that feedback loop. I mean, it's funny too, because I have my own personal brand too, I guess. I do a whole bunch of different stuff. So I had to hire somebody because I am terrible at telling my own story, but I do all right telling other people's, cobbler with no shoes, all that fun stuff. And so I defaulted to somebody else and said, can you do all of this? We've put up different videos. We've talked about like, how much do I appear on screen versus not? Terrifying things. I had to have a therapist for 3 months talking about that. And they gave me that great line, like, people do not see you, they see themselves. So it's not about you. It really isn't. And, just seeing it as a conduit. So I'm a conduit and a speaking piece sometimes for these other folks. But we've had videos go on TikTok and get over like 3.5 million views. And it was nothing educated. It actually made me sad, because I'm sitting there, I'm like, how, why, so I never like to think of it as like, oh, these are just the single channels that you have to use. What I find is again, if you jump to those questions, like, should I be on Snapchat? Should I be on, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whatever that is, or LinkedIn too, and having certain articles that are just geared toward this LinkedIn audience. Who is your target market? What are you really going for? I would try to think more about it on that pre-production level than on the end. Because it does, and it gets a little I think, a little hectic and a little frustrating. But you can have, like, when I'm trying to convince younger folks of eating, or I'm trying to convince them to get their parents to buy, from local farms or whatever else like that too, TikTok isn't a bad place,
Yeah.
and really, when you're doing that storytelling, same thing. You're talking about 10-second snippets, even less than that, keeping it under 7 seconds. And you're talking about storytelling within that window. Sometimes it can just make your, eyes roll into the back of your head. But I think if you think about it in terms of the structure of a story, it becomes a lot easier, especially when you're thinking about it in terms of things like brand story or narrative marketing, or like, all right, this is what we're going after. And then you can either get, there's companies like mine, there's a bunch of others too, but then they can help you figure out how to disseminate that. How do we actually make that content? So it's usually much more helpful when folks come to me and they say, like, this is the idea we want to get across, as opposed to they're like, hey, we had one meeting and somebody came up with a great idea. And then it's like, what was that? So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but there's not really one channel that I would say. I think it's more about, social media is not free. It takes up so much of your time. Digital marketing in general too, whether it's on your website, wherever it is, trying to think about those strategies, I think, is most helpful. You actually, we saw each other at the conference. Did you see the Edible Blue Ridge article?
Yeah, we did a webinar with them a few months back on earned media, and it's a great, right? That's a whole different strategy of getting other people to cover you and giving them helpful assets, and they have their own audience, their own perspective. That's an angle to pursue too. I think, especially if their audience has a lot of overlap with yours, a lot of commonalities. And I think this is going to be, knowing your customer. Hey, I'm so sorry to do this, but I'm going to turn off my camera for a second because we were talking about it beforehand. I'm getting a visit from my cat, and he's not going to shut up until he gets in here. So give me one moment, but please go ahead and answer here.
Sure.
Yeah, about Blue Ridge.
Yeah. What I was going to say was that I took a strategy around, and again, this is that experimentation. I wanted to hit social, print, and web, and figure out how to connect those, how to create a rabbit hole for a story. And the whole centerpiece was grain in Virginia, and it was centered around, the stone mills kind of coming back. So what I did was I went out and interviewed a farmer, the millers themselves, and then 3 bakers, artisan bakers. But I filmed all of these. I took the whole interviews, I put them into 15-minute videos, all of those, and with Murphy and Rude too. So you had an additional video too for another article in there. All of those 15-minute interviews are online on YouTube, right? And then what I did was we wrote these articles. I wrote one of them, collaborated with another writer. So we have a 9-page spread in a magazine that's centering around this whole story about what's going on and setting that stage for what the history was of it, what people are doing now, and kind of why that's exciting and where it's going. And then I took all the pullout quotes that were highlighted and I said, well, this would be great to be social media posts. So we posted one from each of the people involved in it, and even one that was a step-by-step of how a stone mill works. And then did those as social media posts. So the idea being, if we work from the beginning, people may see a 10-second snippet of somebody talking about a bakery, whatever else, that points them to this article that they can read. That article then points them to the fact that they can watch these full interviews. How many people are going to go all the way down that rabbit hole? I mean, I think we were trying to watch the click-through rates. That was far more important than comments or anything else, just for us in terms of that strategy and seeing who got all the way through the gates. And it dwindles down. But for those that did get all the way through that, you now have ambassadors for that concept and that story. Those people are now telling that story to other people, right? And that's really, in a lot of what I do, that's really the goal, is having others that they want to become unofficial brand ambassadors in a sense, because they've appreciated that story so much and see so much of themselves in it that that's something that they pick up. And it's not like convincing them to believe in something. It's something they already believe in, and giving them a more helpful story to tell that. And I try not to stat spat too much, but like there's, putting something in the form of a story helps people retain information so much more than if it is just kind of like, I don't know, 25 less calories, whatever it is. It's something that really is the vessel that allows people to carry on information and share it with others.
Yeah, yeah, I like that, and I think you're like for this story, knowing that you went in to capture this, you some of it was emergent, right? You had these and kind of see, but like you knew that there was enough story here. You captured content, knowing about how to frame it for different avenues, knowing that there's different audiences for each of these channels that you're putting it into. There may be what in like the sales space would be like a customer journey, but an audience journey of, hey, like I'm willing to invest 15 seconds in you on or 10 seconds. I don't
Yeah.
know how to talk, but I'm willing to do that. Well, now I'm willing to read an article, and maybe then I'll go all the way through. You're getting, like you said, if that audience goes through, but it gets smaller along the path, well, that's fine. You're allowing people to opt in over time. There's long tail on some of these things, and not every story is going to justify that level of care or that much investment.
Yep.
But I think that comes back to like, how important is the story for us, for our brand? Is this the opportunity, or if this is more succinct where we're talking about, a single moment in time? Well, capturing and investing in like you said, none of this happens for free. Hey, we're making the investment that this is going to be going into these channels. We don't need to have a 9-page story and 10, 15-minute videos, but we need at least this much, right? We need these assets because it's part of our story.
Yeah, and how to keep it going. And I think you're hitting it on the head. It's really just figuring out like, what is it we really need versus what we want? Are we trying to emulate somebody else as opposed to, this is the story, this is the architecture that they have, and that's really going to be the most helpful.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I usually find that people underspend on marketing as opposed to going over.
Mm-hmm.
But when they do, it's just the fact of finding more effective narratives as opposed to just throwing it at the wall and again trying like every different type and style.
Yeah, the trend chasing, right? You see somebody do something cool and it might be very expensive, it might work for them, may not fit with your company, your audience. Yeah, so that brings me to something that I was hoping you could talk a little bit about, and we don't need any names, but
Sure.
Common issues with people about how they build out their stories, about if they're not getting the level of engagement they like. What are some of the common pitfalls that you see with companies that are, okay, we're going to take a run at this, and they either are spinning their wheels or not getting traction? What do you see to be some of those common pitfalls?
So I have 5 companies that are in our region that I would like to call out. No, I'm just kidding. The perfect opportunity for that. No. So a lot of the issues really come, kind of common pitfalls around that too. It really, the biggest one is the unclear target audience. Not having, it's my favorite, absolutely my favorite. Brings joy throughout my body when somebody goes, for selling a food product, like, so who is your target audience? Well, anybody that eats, that kind of a thing. It really is important to zero that in. And marketing companies used to do this too, like profiling people in a certain way. Try not to do that on demographics too much, but demographic and ideological too, and figuring out, like, again, who are those people. That's something I do in early, like with companies when I do consulting, working through some of those profiles in a sense too, about who those people are and your target demographics. So that's a big one, of not having, a lot of this is just going to be the word clarity. So not having clarity on that target audience, kind of lacking any kind of compelling content. Again, I knock myself for saying this, but there's great quality content. I think you need to be above a certain threshold of quality for it to be okay. But again, like, I have a camera that can take 400 megapixel pictures. That's ridiculous. And somewhat, it's really cool for product shots, and you can zoom in all the way and put little Easter eggs in those shots. That's nowhere near as necessary as figuring out what the narrative is and the subject matter. That is far more important, but having a kind of cohesive mission that you're going after, that's one of the biggest things people miss out on, is they're not consistent. And this doesn't just mean every Tuesday and Thursday I'm putting up a post. It really means that consistency in the brand story we were talking about. It's kind of like, I'm going to try a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of everything. And then you end up going nowhere. Another one that I see too is kind of a failure to adapt to trends. That's something that pops out. And again, there is finding a balance. There's a lot of this trend chasing in certain ways, but that chasing part is also these inconsistencies. It's more about folks that are like, our sales are pretty fine. We're happy with it. You know, we've been doing the same thing for 5 years. And it's like, you have to check back in every once in a while too, and figure out too, whether that narrative's changed, whether the demographic of your purchasers has changed. And I know there's beer companies in this area too, where they were figuring that out, like they were a craft beer and then they became like a dad beer. And then they had to rebrand to become, hit a younger demographic and reintroduce themselves. So, there is this evolving sense of marketing, and some folks just let it kind of go to, I guess, the area that they're most comfortable with, but it becomes stagnant in a sense too, right? They're not looking at who's actually showing up to the brewery, winery, or distillery, who's actually coming in and starting to engage. Keep an eye on that. See some of those things too. Talk to your staff about like, what kind of jobs do people have that are coming in? Like, are they on vacation? Are they coming in for the visit? Are they consistently coming in? Like, that interfacing becomes so important and helpful. And then again, it leads to another thing that I see is the ineffective call to action, right? The thing at the end where you want to, what's the step? And I think that there's also something really important about, we're talking about more and more digital asset marketing. I'm very big on the fact of like, these things need to, convince people to an action. It's catalyzing, right? You don't want people to feel like they had the vicarious, virtual experience of visiting your, microbrewery or some place and they never went there. Like, the idea is to get them to an action. So again, this comes in with, great, you got someone's attention. What did you do with it once you had it? And being very careful about all of that. But I think the biggest thing is just, responding to feedback and adapting. It's one of the biggest things that I feel like people just kind of set up a brand, we'll call it a strategy, but it's mostly just like, some of these, I saw this picture, get one of those pictures, as opposed to figuring out a trailhead map that is going to carry you on and keep you consistent. And again, you can deviate from the past sometimes, but at least you know the direction that you're going.
Yeah. I like that. It's not a set it and forget it thing, right? We've all seen the brands that have had the same look for 20 years, and it, unless they're really waiting it out and trying to come back around on the retro thing, then it may feel a little stale. But not also the folks who are trying to be everything to everyone, or they're the going after, we know we want young people, so we're going to do these things, and we're doing the nostalgic 80s throwback look because we think we're going after people a few years older than me. And then there's going back to the authenticity, like, hey, you don't have to be everything to everyone. It's certainly in a sector like this, the way we're going, is more and more concentration. So the generalist brands are not resonating as much anymore, right? Saying, have a perspective, have a lane. If you're trying to serve everyone, you're serving no one, and making sure that this strategy builds into the sales strategy and everything else, right? This is all interrelated. I'm not trying to make this too grand, here where we're saying, this you have to rethink about who you are and what your plan is, but it needs to align. And ideally, when you're thinking about your company and where you're trying to take it, well, who is our audience? What are they doing? Is the audience changing? How are we adapting? Do we need to do something? And is that us? Are we the ones to be doing that? Sometimes the answer is no, even if there is an opportunity, it's not you.
Right. And that comes into that authenticity of it too. You can be authentic towards somebody else too, as opposed to, like, again, if you're trying to tell your story personally, and when I say it's not usually like CEO stories, right? But sometimes it is, if it's a micro business, especially, and there's only a few people in there too. And that's why it's sometimes helpful. I try to usually teach it in a way where it's like, you want to hire an outside company, but make it sustainable for yourself. So you're not dependent on that outside source. Like, and you can do, and again, I work with farmers a lot of the time. So it's kind of like, I'll set them up for success, but the only success comes where, again, it's clear for them and concise. It's something that they can very easily do because it's going to take up time and there's not a lot of free time. And then same thing, how do we get it just above that quality threshold so that we can make it work and keep it going? And then you have these bigger companies where it's more like, all right, we can afford the quality, but now let's make sure we're refining that out too, and being very diligent about, you know, how we're going about the storytelling. And again, I'm just so big on it. Like, pre-production is everything. If you have that nailed down, if you have a narrative arc, if you have a story, if you can see that ahead of time, you're not going out and going fishing for content, which is, I feel like, the other strategy where it's like, well, let's just go take 200 photos and see, you know, if the light's good that day. Like, don't do it.
Yeah. That's it keeps people busy, which does not mean that it's effective. Well, hey, I know we're coming up to the end of our hour here, and I really appreciate your time. But before I let you go, any last thoughts or kind of last words that you want to share with our audience today on, you know, creating compelling visuals?
Yeah. So for me, I always love summarizing things up. And so this morning I was listening to some music and Garth Brooks came on. So I'm going to use him as my conduit just because it's something that happened in my day. This is not trying to relate to anyone. But it was that song, A Dream is Like a River. I don't, I actually don't know who's on this call, so if I'm going to relate to my audience or not. But the way I put it into context was, and I literally started singing this in the car, like while I was driving around, which I was debating doing that here, but I don't want to be that memorable. So the way to think about it too is that a story is like a river, ever changing as it goes. And the brand is just a vessel that must follow where it flows, trying to learn from what's behind them and never knowing what's in store. So that makes each day a constant battle just to stay between the shores. Okay. So if you think about it that way too, the story itself is the river. You do not control necessarily that story or what's going on in the world or what's happening with, you know, COVID and whatever else. But your brand is a vessel. You got to keep it between the navigational beacons, keep it going. And every once in a while, you do have to check in on, are you going along, you know, running aground? Are you like, what are you doing? And really reassess to keep that going down. It is not something, it's not a straight line that you can just then move along. There are rapids, there are, you know, it's different times in your business as it changes. And sometimes you got to grow that too. But just as a tie into a jingle, if you will. But yeah, that would be my closing thoughts.
I like it. Yeah. I don't know the song, and I'm sorry I didn't have the backing track here for you. If we had figured out how to share the audio, I didn't want to risk it. But hey, really appreciate your time, DJ, and your expertise. Yeah, really appreciate you sharing that with the audience. So thanks to everyone for tuning in today. So stay tuned for the next edition of the Craft Beverage webinar series. We should have a session in December. So I'll let everybody get on with their day, but I'll just say thanks again to all of you for joining, and Daniel James of Herd Ventures for enlightening us all.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you both. And I loved that summary at the end. That will stick. That was a great story. It'll stick with me. So I would like to thank everyone for attending today. You will receive an email with a link to the recording. If you would like to sign up for upcoming webinars or access recorded webinars, please visit virginiasbdc.org/training. These resources are designed to be used in collaboration with your local SBDC advisors. You can sign up for a free and confidential session by emailing help@virginiasbdc.org or via our website. And we do hope to see you at our next session. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.